The morning sun climbs over the Giza plateau with the same golden indifference it has shown for thousands of years, casting long shadows across the sand, while tourists begin their pilgrimage to monuments that have outlasted empires, religions, and entire civilizations. And on this particular day, in 1990, a geologist named Robert Schoch stands before the Great Sphinx with the kind of innocence that comes from not yet knowing that he is about to ignite one of the most explosive controversies in the history of archaeology. A controversy that will pit scientist against scientist, discipline against discipline, and ultimately force humanity to confront the uncomfortable possibility that everything we think we know about the origins of civilization might be built on foundations as unstable as the desert sand itself. For most visitors to the Sphinx, the experience is one of reverent tourism, a checked box on the bucket list of human achievement, a selfie opportunity with one of the world's most recognizable monuments, and perhaps a vague recollection from high school history class that this massive limestone creature, part lion, part pharaoh, all mystery, was carved around 2500 BCE during Egypt's 4th dynasty, probably commissioned by Pharaoh Khafre, whose pyramid looms behind it like a stone shadow. A timeline so settled and certain that it appears in every textbook, every documentary, every museum placard, from Cairo to Cambridge. The narrative is comfortable in its certainty, reassuring in its completeness, and it has the weight of over a century of Egyptological consensus behind it. The accumulated confidence of generations of scholars who mapped the dynasties, decoded the hieroglyphs, and constructed a chronology of ancient Egypt so detailed that we can name the pharaohs, date their reigns, and trace the evolution of their civilization with what seems like scientific precision. But Schoch, trained in the hard science of geology rather than the interpretive art of archaeology, is looking at the Sphinx with different eyes. Eyes that see not the artistic achievement or the cultural significance, but rather the physical evidence written into the very stone itself. And what he sees troubles him in ways that will soon trouble the entire academic establishment. Running vertically down the limestone body of the Sphinx, carved deep into the rock face of the enclosure that surrounds it, are weathering patterns that speak a language geologists understand intimately. The distinctive vertical channels and undulating profiles created by sustained rainfall, by water cascading down stone over centuries and millennia, eroding it in patterns as recognizable to a geologist as handwriting is to a forensic examiner. The problem, the monumentally inconvenient problem that will soon explode into academic journals and heated conferences, is that Egypt has not experienced the kind of sustained, heavy rainfall necessary to create such erosion patterns for at least 7,000 years, and more likely not since the end of the African humid period, around 10,000 BCE, a time when the Sahara was not a desert, but a verdant savanna of flowing rivers and abundant wildlife, a green paradise that exists now only in ancient lake beds, prehistoric cave paintings, and the geological record that Schoch reads like a history book written in stone. If the erosion on the Sphinx was caused by rainfall, and if Egypt hasn't had that kind of rainfall since the end of the last ice age, then the mathematics become brutally simple, and the implications become staggering. The Sphinx must be thousands of years older than traditional Egyptology claims, carved not during the age of the pyramids, but during a time when, according to every mainstream historical narrative, human beings were supposedly scattered hunter-gatherers without cities, without agriculture, and certainly without the sophisticated civilization necessary to conceive and execute one of the most ambitious monuments in human history. The reaction from the Egyptological establishment is swift, fierce, and completely predictable. Because what Schoch is suggesting is not merely a minor adjustment to the timeline, not a quibble over a few centuries here or there, but rather a complete dismantling of the carefully constructed narrative of civilization's linear progress. An assault on the fundamental story we tell ourselves about humanity's journey from primitive to advanced, from caves to pyramids, from darkness to enlightenment. To accept Schoch's geological evidence would require not just rewriting one chapter of history, but reconsidering the entire book, questioning whether our neat progression from simple to complex is actually accurate, or merely a comforting fiction we've imposed on a past that was far more mysterious, far more sophisticated, and far more ancient than we've ever dared to imagine. Imagine for a moment that you are an automotive engineer who has spent your entire career studying the history of transportation, who has published papers and taught students and built a reputation on your expertise in the evolution of the automobile. And then one day, a materials scientist appears with incontrovertible evidence that the wheel was actually invented after the first cars were already being driven, that the entire timeline you've devoted your life to understanding is fundamentally backwards. The cognitive dissonance would be crushing, the institutional resistance would be immense, and the temptation to find any explanation, however convoluted, that preserves the existing paradigm would be nearly irresistible. And this is precisely the situation that Schoch's observations create within the field of Egyptology. The defenders of the traditional chronology marshal their counter-arguments with the confidence of established authority, pointing to the artifacts found around the Sphinx, to the temple complexes adjacent to it that clearly date to Khafra's reign, to the hieroglyphic inscriptions and the cultural context and the entire mountain of archaeological evidence that places the Sphinx firmly in the 4th dynasty, around 2500 BCE. And they raise entirely reasonable questions about how a civilization sophisticated enough to carve the Sphinx could have existed during the Stone Age without leaving behind the usual detritus of civilization. The pottery shards, the tools, the dwelling foundations, the trash heaps and burial grounds that archaeologists rely on to reconstruct ancient societies. Where are the cities that would have housed the workers? Where are the quarries that provided the stone? Where is any evidence whatsoever of a pre-Egyptian civilization capable of such monumental architecture? And if Schoch cannot produce this evidence, then surely the simpler explanation is that he has misinterpreted the erosion patterns, that there must be some other explanation, perhaps groundwater, perhaps sand abrasion, perhaps anything other than rainfall from an era that predates civilization itself. But Schoch stands his ground with the quiet confidence of someone whose evidence is literally carved in stone, inviting skeptics to examine the Sphinx's weathering patterns and compare them to every other monument on the Giza plateau, to the temples and tombs and structures that unquestionably date to the dry period of Egyptian history. all of which show the distinctive horizontal weathering caused by wind-blown sand, the sharp edges and angular profiles that result from thousands of years in a desert environment. Patterns completely different from the deep vertical channels and smooth undulations visible on the Sphinx and its enclosure. The erosion patterns are not ambiguous, not subject to interpretation, not a matter of opinion, but rather of physical law, of the way water interacts with limestone over vast stretches of time. And to explain them away requires increasingly contorted logic, increasingly improbable scenarios, increasingly desperate attempts to preserve a paradigm that the rocks themselves seem to contradict. This is not the first time in scientific history that physical evidence has collided with established consensus, that the rocks have told a different story than the textbooks, and the pattern is always the same. Initial ridicule, institutional resistance, academic careers threatened, and then, slowly, painfully, a grudging reconsideration as the evidence refuses to disappear, no matter how many experts dismiss it. Alfred Wegener proposed continental drift in 1912 and was mocked by the geological establishment for decades, until seafloor spreading proved him correct. Ignaz Semmelweis demonstrated that hand-washing prevented disease and was institutionalized for challenging medical orthodoxy. And Barry Marshall had to deliberately infect himself with bacteria to prove that ulcers were not caused by stress, but by H. pylori, winning a Nobel Prize for what had initially been dismissed as quackery. The resistance to paradigm shifts is not conspiracy, but rather human nature, institutional inertia, and the simple fact that changing fundamental assumptions is intellectually and professionally painful, requiring scholars to question not just this one monument, but potentially their entire understanding of how civilization developed, when it developed, and what our ancestors were capable of achieving. If the Sphinx is truly older than the pyramids, older than dynastic Egypt, older than agriculture and cities, and everything we thought marked the beginning of complex civilization, then what else might we be wrong about? What other assumptions might crumble under closer examination? And how can we trust any of our carefully constructed timelines when the most iconic monument in the world refuses to fit neatly into its assigned place in history? And there is something else, something that nags at anyone who examines the Sphinx closely. A curious absence that speaks as loudly as the erosion patterns themselves. There are no inscriptions on the Sphinx claiming credit for its construction, no hieroglyphs proclaiming which pharaoh commissioned this marvel, no propaganda celebrating the achievement. Which is extraordinarily strange, because ancient Egyptian rulers were nothing if not enthusiastic self-promoters who carved their names on everything they built, and frequently on things they did not build, claiming credit for renovating or restoring monuments created by their predecessors. Pharaohs would usurp each other's statues, chisel out their rivals' names and insert their own, engage in shameless historical revisionism to aggrandize their reigns. And yet, the Sphinx, the most prominent monument on the Giza plateau, sits in mute anonymity, its creator unrecorded, its purpose unexplained, its origins shrouded in silence that has lasted for millennia. Why would Khafra, if he truly carved this monument, pass up the opportunity for the ultimate historical flex, chance to have his name associated forever with one of the wonders of the ancient world? And why would every subsequent pharaoh similarly resist the temptation to claim it as their own, especially during later periods when Egypt's glory was fading and rulers were desperate to link themselves to the grandeur of the Old Kingdom. The silence is deafening. The absence of self-congratulation is suspicious. And it raises the possibility that the Sphinx was already ancient when the pyramids were built, already weathered and mysterious and attributed to the gods rather than to mortal kings, already occupying the same liminal space between history and myth that it occupies today. As the sun climbs higher over Giza and the tourists continue their oblivious pilgrimage, Schoch's observations sit like an unexploded bomb in the careful edifice of ancient history, ticking quietly, waiting for someone to acknowledge the fundamental question that cannot be asked without unraveling everything we think we understand about the origins of human civilization. What if the Sphinx is not a product of the Egypt we know from textbooks and hieroglyphs, but rather a survivor from an earlier world, a monument created by hands we have never named, built by a civilization we have never acknowledged, standing as silent testimony to a chapter of human history that predates writing, predates our historical records, and challenges our most basic assumptions about when and how we became who we are. The question hangs in the air above the limestone lion, shimmering in the desert heat like a mirage. And once asked, it cannot be unasked. And once considered, it opens a door to possibilities both thrilling and terrifying. That our timeline is wrong. That our ancestors were more capable than we imagined. That civilizations rise and fall in cycles we have not recognized. And that the greatest mystery is not what the Sphinx was built to protect, but rather what truth about our own past we have been protecting ourselves from by refusing to see what the stones have been trying to tell us all along. The comfortable narrative of human civilization that we inherit from textbooks and museum exhibitions follows a progression so linear and logical that it feels almost inevitable. A story that begins with scattered bands of hunter-gatherers wandering the prehistoric wilderness in pursuit of game and wild plants, then transitions smoothly to the agricultural revolution around 10,000 BCE, when humans supposedly discovered farming and settled down, which led naturally to permanent villages, then to cities, then to the emergence of writing and mathematics and organized religion, and finally, around 3000 BCE, to the sudden flowering of Egyptian civilization, with its pyramids and temples and elaborate bureaucracy. A timeline so neat and tidy that it creates the impression of a species gradually climbing a ladder of progress, each rung representing a new achievement, each generation building incrementally on the innovations of the last, until we arrive at the technological sophistication of the modern world. But what if this narrative, for all its pedagogical convenience and intuitive appeal, is not merely incomplete, but fundamentally misleading? A simplification imposed on a past that was far messier, far more cyclical, and far more sophisticated than our linear model can accommodate. And what if the Sphinx, with its geological evidence of impossible antiquity, is not an anomaly to be explained away, but rather a clue pointing toward a radically different understanding of humanity's deep history? The problem with the standard timeline becomes particularly acute when we examine what it actually requires to create something like the Sphinx. Because carving a monument 73 meters long and 20 meters high out of solid limestone bedrock is not a task that a group of recent agriculturalists could accomplish on a whim, but rather demands a level of social organization, technical expertise, and cultural sophistication that supposedly did not exist during the wet Saharan period, when the erosion patterns suggest the monument was created. You need not just tools capable of working hard stone with precision, but also the metallurgical knowledge to create and maintain those tools, the engineering understanding to plan a project of such scale, the artistic vision to conceive the design and execute it with aesthetic coherence, the logistical capacity to feed and house and coordinate the labor force over what must have been years or decades of continuous work, and perhaps most tellingly, the astronomical or religious or political motivation to invest such enormous resources in a purely symbolic structure that serves no practical function related to survival or food production. This is not the profile of a Stone Age culture scratching out a subsistence existence, but rather of a complex society with surplus resources, specialized labor, hierarchical organization, and the kind of long-term planning that characterizes what we call civilization. And yet, according to conventional archaeology, no such civilization existed during the African humid period. No cities have been excavated from that era. No evidence of the elaborate social structures necessary for monumental architecture has been found, which leads to an impasse. Either the geological evidence for the Sphinx's age is wrong, or our understanding of what was possible in prehistoric times is catastrophically incomplete. And then, just when this debate seemed destined to remain forever unresolved, archaeologists working in southeastern Turkey in the 1990s began uncovering something that should not exist according to any mainstream model of civilization's development. Göbekli Tepe, whose name means potbelly hill in Turkish, turned out to be a massive complex of stone temples and megalithic pillars arranged in circles, decorated with sophisticated carvings of animals and abstract symbols, built with a level of architectural ambition and artistic skill that rivals anything produced by later civilizations, and dated through multiple independent methods to approximately 9,500 BCE, making it over 6,000 years older than Stonehenge and contemporary with the end of the last ice age, when humans were supposedly living in small nomadic bands without permanent settlements or monumental architecture. The implications of Göbekli Tepe reverberate through archaeology like seismic shocks, because here is undeniable proof that hunter-gatherers, people without agriculture or cities or any of the supposed prerequisites for civilization, were nevertheless capable of organizing massive construction projects requiring the coordinated labor of hundreds of people, the quarrying and transport of limestone pillars weighing up to 10 tons, the carving of elaborate artistic designs with symbolic or religious significance, and the sustained commitment to a single location over centuries of continuous use and expansion, shattering the comfortable assumption that monumental architecture requires settled agricultural societies, and demonstrating that our ancestors possessed capabilities and motivations that do not fit neatly into the evolutionary ladder we have constructed for them. If hunter-gatherers in Turkey could build Göbekli Tepe 11,000 years ago, then why is it impossible to imagine that a comparably sophisticated culture in North Africa could have carved the Sphinx during the same period when the Sahara was green and hospitable, when the climate was favorable and the resources were abundant, and the conditions were far more conducive to large-scale projects than the harsh desert environment that would emerge later. The sophistication required for these ancient monuments becomes even more striking when we consider not just the labor and organization, but the knowledge embedded in their construction. Because creating the Sphinx is not merely a matter of chipping away at rock until a lion-shaped form emerges, but requires a deep understanding of geology to select stone that will endure millennia of weathering, of engineering to ensure structural stability in a monument carved from bedrock, of proportion and perspective to achieve aesthetic coherence on such a massive scale, and possibly of astronomy, if the monument's orientation was aligned to celestial events or cardinal directions. All of which suggests a intellectual tradition, a accumulated body of technical knowledge passed down through generations and refined through practice and observation. Modern engineers attempting to replicate ancient construction techniques are continually surprised by the sophistication of what they find, discovering that Roman concrete, for instance, used a specific mixture of volcanic ash and seawater that creates a chemical reaction, producing a material more durable than modern Portland cement, a formula that was lost for centuries and is only now being rediscovered through advanced materials science. Or that the Antikythera mechanism found in a Roman shipwreck was an astronomical calculator of such complexity that nothing comparable appears in the historical record for another 1,000 years. A device whose existence proves that ancient peoples possessed technological capabilities that disappeared and had to be reinvented by later civilizations. These examples of lost knowledge and technological regression appear throughout history like gaps in the fossil record, moments when human capabilities seem to contract rather than expand, when civilizations collapse and their achievements are forgotten, when libraries burn and oral traditions die with their keepers, and entire bodies of knowledge vanish as though they had never existed. And this pattern suggests that human progress is not a steady upward climb, but rather a series of cycles, waves of achievement followed by catastrophic collapse. Golden ages giving way to dark ages, sophisticated civilizations reduced to scattered survivors who must rebuild from fragments of what was lost. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE saw the destruction of nearly every major civilization in the Mediterranean and Near East, plunging the region into centuries of reduced literacy, diminished trade, and lost technologies. While the fall of Rome initiated what medieval Europeans called the Dark Ages, when classical learning survived only in isolated monasteries, and the engineering prowess that had built aqueducts and amphitheatres was forgotten. And more recently, the knowledge held by indigenous cultures around the world, their astronomical observations, their medicinal plants, their sustainable agricultural practices, has been lost to colonization and cultural genocide, demonstrating that knowledge is always fragile, always one catastrophe away from extinction. So the question becomes not whether ancient peoples could have possessed sophisticated knowledge that later disappeared, because the historical record proves repeatedly that they could and did, but rather whether we should expect the physical evidence of such lost civilizations to survive in a form that modern archaeology can recognize. And here we encounter a fundamental problem of preservation and discovery that creates enormous blind spots in our understanding of the deep past. If we imagine a civilization arising during the African humid period, between 12,000 and 7,000 years ago, flourishing in the green Sahara with its rivers and lakes and abundant resources, developing the social complexity and technical expertise necessary to create monuments like the Sphinx, and then collapsing as the climate shifted and the desert expanded, driving the survivors to migrate to the Nile Valley, where they would eventually become the dynastic Egyptians who claimed but did not create the monuments they found. What evidence would such a civilization leave behind that we could still find today after 10,000 years of subsequent history? The answer, uncomfortable and inconvenient as it may be, is very little. Because the materials that most human cultures use for everyday life, wood for buildings and tools, leather for clothing and containers, rope and textiles and basketry, even metals which oxidize and decay, do not survive millennia of exposure to the elements, while organic remains, like bones and seeds and food waste, decompose or are scattered by scavengers, and the places where ancient peoples chose to live, near water sources and on fertile land, are precisely the locations that later peoples also occupied, building over the earlier settlements, disturbing or destroying the archaeological layers, creating a palimpsest where earlier chapters are overwritten by later ones. Archaeological sites that do survive intact are the exception rather than the rule. Preserved by unusual circumstances like sudden burial under volcanic ash as at Pompeii, or rapid submersion in anaerobic mud that prevents decay, or location in remote areas that were abandoned and never reoccupied. But even under ideal conditions, organic materials rarely survive more than a few thousand years, which means that a civilization from 10 or 12,000 years ago would leave behind mainly the most durable objects: stone tools, pottery if they had it, and any monuments or structures built from imperishable stone. And here we arrive at a provocative possibility: that the Sphinx, and other megalithic structures around the world that stubbornly resist our attempts to fit them into conventional chronologies, might not be anomalies at all, but rather the only surviving traces of cultures whose wooden buildings have rotted away, whose metal tools have corroded to dust, whose written records on papyrus or leather or bark have long since decomposed, whose entire material culture has vanished except for the monuments they built in stone, precisely because they understood, perhaps through bitter experience of earlier collapses, that only stone endures. Only megalithic architecture can speak across the vast abysses of time. Only monuments that defy human scale and weather and the erosion of ages can preserve the memory that something significant once existed here. The choice to build in stone, to haul multi-ton blocks and carve bedrock, and create structures that seem almost deliberately over-engineered for their apparent purpose, might not be primitive excess or religious mania, but rather a sophisticated strategy for communicating with the deep future. A message in the most durable medium available, saying simply, "We were here. We were capable. We existed before the desert came and the world changed, and our names were forgotten." This interpretation gains credence when we consider how similar megalithic traditions appear in cultures around the world that supposedly had no contact with each other. From the massive stone platforms of Baalbek in Lebanon to the precisely fitted walls of Sacsayhuaman in Peru, from the enigmatic moai of Easter Island to the dolmens and stone circles scattered across Europe and Asia, all demonstrating a preference for working with stone in ways that seem to exceed practical necessity, creating monuments that endure, while everything else about these cultures, their languages, their daily lives, their specific beliefs, fades into archaeological speculation. The pattern suggests not that all these cultures were in contact with each other, though some may have been, but rather that building in stone represented a common human response to the problem of impermanence, an attempt to anchor meaning and memory in matter that transcends the fragility of wood and flesh, and everything else that time inevitably destroys. The resistance to reconsidering the timeline of the Sphinx and other ancient monuments comes not from conspiracy or closed-mindedness, though those factors sometimes play a role, but from the legitimate methodological challenge of proposing major revisions to established chronologies without producing the kind of evidence that archaeology traditionally requires: the stratified layers of occupation, the diagnostic artifacts, the carbon-datable organic remains, the written records, or at least the pottery sequences that allow us to distinguish one period from another with confidence. Asking Egyptologists to accept that the Sphinx predates dynastic Egypt by thousands of years, based solely on geological weathering patterns, no matter how compelling those patterns may be, requires them to privilege one type of evidence over all the others, to conclude that the rocks are telling the truth, while the archaeological context is misleading. And this is genuinely difficult because it demands a paradigm shift that calls into question not just the dating of one monument, but the entire framework through which we interpret the ancient past. Yet, paradigm shifts, however disruptive and uncomfortable they may be, are precisely how science progresses, how we move from Ptolemaic geocentrism to Copernican heliocentrism, from Newtonian mechanics to Einsteinian relativity, from fixity of species to Darwinian evolution. And each of these revolutions in understanding required the scientific community to abandon cherished assumptions and accept that the universe was stranger, more complex, and more wonderful than previously imagined. The possibility that human civilization is thousands of years older than we thought, that our ancestors achieved sophistication earlier than our models predict, that knowledge and capabilities have been lost and rediscovered multiple times throughout our species' long history, is not a retreat into pseudo-archaeology or ancient aliens or any of the other fringe theories that exploit gaps in our knowledge, but rather an invitation to take seriously what the physical evidence suggests, even when it contradicts expectations, to remain humble about the limits of what we can know about the deep past, and to recognize that the story of human achievement is probably far more ancient, far more tragic in its cycles of rise and fall, and ultimately far more inspiring than the simple linear narrative we teach in schools. Standing before the Sphinx with its enigmatic erosion and its silent testimony to vanished millennia, we are confronted with a question that echoes across the ages. Who built you? And what world have you witnessed? And what civilizations rose and fell while you gazed eternally eastward toward the rising sun? and most haunting of all, what else have we forgotten about ourselves? What other chapters of human history lie buried beneath the sand, or submerged beneath the sea, or hidden in plain sight because we have trained ourselves not to see what doesn't fit our predetermined conclusions about when and how we became civilized? If modern civilization were to collapse tomorrow in some catastrophic convergence of nuclear war, pandemic, or climate catastrophe, and if 10,000 years were to pass before our descendants or some other intelligent species began excavating the ruins of our world, what would they find? And more importantly, what would they conclude about us, based on the selective survival of our artifacts through the vast erosive forces of deep time? The answer, both humbling and instructive, is that almost nothing of our daily existence would remain. The wooden houses would have rotted away within decades. The steel and concrete towers would have crumbled and rusted into unrecognizable rubble within centuries. The vast networks of roads and bridges and infrastructure would be reduced to enigmatic traces in the landscape. The billions of plastic objects we have produced would have photodegraded and fragmented into molecular residues. The electronic devices containing all our knowledge and culture and history would be corroded lumps of toxic metals with their information irretrievably lost. And even our proudest engineering achievements, like skyscrapers and dams and airports, would exist only as anomalous geological formations, if they existed at all, leaving perhaps only a few things that could endure the millennia. Monuments carved from granite, like Mount Rushmore, the massive stone slabs of Georgia guidestones before their destruction, the concrete bunkers built to house nuclear weapons, and the radioactive waste repositories that we have designed specifically to last hundreds of thousands of years, and which might become the most enduring testament to our civilization's existence. This thought experiment reveals something profound about the archaeological record and the fundamental challenge of understanding deep prehistory. Because what survives is not a representative sample of ancient life, but rather a highly selective and deeply misleading subset determined not by cultural importance or historical significance, but by the physics and chemistry of material degradation, by the simple fact that organic materials decompose, while stone endures, that wood rots, but granite remains, that papyrus crumbles, while limestone monuments weather slowly over epochs. Which means that when we look at the remains of ancient civilizations, we are seeing not their complete reality, but only the most durable fragments. And from these fragments, we must somehow reconstruct entire worlds. An endeavor that is part detective work, part informed speculation, and part acknowledgement that vast portions of the past are simply inaccessible to us, no matter how sophisticated our methods become. The megalithic monuments scattered across the ancient world, Stonehenge and the Karnak stones, and the temples of Malta, and the massive blocks of Baalbek, and yes, potentially the Sphinx itself, might represent not the totality of their builders' achievements, but merely the portion that was designed or happened to survive, the tip of a cultural iceberg whose bulk has dissolved into the ocean of time. Consider the deliberate choices that ancient builders made when they selected stone for their most important monuments. because working with massive blocks of limestone or granite or basalt is extraordinarily labor-intensive compared to building with wood or mud brick, requiring specialized tools and considerable expertise and the coordination of large workforces. And yet, cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years independently chose to invest these enormous resources in stone construction for their temples and tombs and ceremonial centers, while building their houses and workshops and everyday structures from perishable materials that have long since vanished. This pattern appears so consistently across different civilizations that it suggests not merely practical considerations about durability, but perhaps a conscious awareness that stone represents permanence. That megalithic construction is a form of communication with the future, a way of ensuring that some trace of achievement and meaning will outlast the inevitable decay of everything else. And if this interpretation has merit, then the ancient builders were essentially creating time capsules, encoding their most important messages in the most durable medium available. Because they understood, possibly through bitter experience of previous cultural collapses, that wood burns, and metals corrode, and even empires fall. But stone monuments can endure for ages beyond reckoning. We can see this same impulse toward permanence in our own civilization's attempts to create markers for nuclear waste repositories, because we face the unprecedented challenge of warning our descendants 10,000 or even 100,000 years in the future about the dangers of radioactive materials that will remain lethal long after every current language has evolved beyond recognition, every current nation has dissolved, and possibly after our entire technological civilization has collapsed and been forgotten, which has led to proposals for massive stone markers carved with warning symbols, for landscapes deliberately engineered to convey danger through their hostile appearance, for information encoded in the most durable materials we can devise, because we understand that paper documents will crumble, electronic storage will fail, metal plaques will corrode, and even languages will change. But stone endures, and landscape endures. And if we want to speak to the deep future, we must use the same medium that the ancients used when they wanted their messages to transcend the ages. The Egyptians themselves were masters of this understanding, obsessively recycling and repurposing monuments from earlier periods, chiseling out the names of previous pharaohs and inserting their own, quarrying facing stones from older pyramids to build new structures, grinding up ancient statues to use as construction fill, creating a palimpsest of overlapping dynasties where determining original authorship becomes nearly impossible. And this habit of architectural cannibalism extended across thousands of years, with later rulers systematically erasing or claiming the work of their predecessors. The Sphinx fits perfectly into this pattern of Egyptian revisionism, surrounded by temples and causeways that clearly date to the Old Kingdom, and that were undoubtedly built or renovated by Khafre's workers. But this does not necessarily mean that the Sphinx itself was carved during that period. Only that the Egyptians of the 4th dynasty recognized its importance and built structures around it and incorporated it into their ceremonial complex. Much as medieval European churches were often built atop pagan sacred sites, claiming and consecrating locations that already held religious significance for earlier peoples, transforming rather than originating the sanctity of place. And then there is the peculiar problem of the Sphinx's head, which has troubled observers for centuries, but which becomes particularly significant when considering the monument's possible antiquity, because the proportions are distinctly wrong. The head is far too small for the massive leonine body, creating an aesthetic imbalance that seems uncharacteristic of Egyptian art, which typically maintained precise proportional relationships between elements. And while some have suggested that this disproportion reflects the original design or results from later erosion, a more provocative explanation emerges from careful examination of the structure itself. If the Sphinx was originally carved as a complete lion during the African humid period, a pure animal form symbolizing power and guardianship, and perhaps aligned with astronomical significance related to the constellation Leo, and if later Egyptians discovered this already ancient monument, weathered by millennia of rainfall, and incorporated it into their sacred landscape, they might well have recarved the lion's head into the idealized human face of a pharaoh, an act of cultural appropriation and religious transformation that would explain both the disproportionate scale, the new head being smaller because they carved it from the already existing head, and the differential weathering between the head, which shows sharper features consistent with later carving, and the body, which bears the deep erosion patterns characteristic of the much earlier wet period. This theory of the recarved head gains additional credence when we consider how thoroughly the Egyptians transformed other aspects of their inherited landscape, taking natural rock formations and enhancing them into sacred architecture, incorporating existing geological features into their religious geography, and consistently demonstrating a willingness to claim and modify rather than always building entirely anew. Because labor was precious, even with a large population to draw upon, and stone carving required specialized skills and considerable time. So if an impressive monument already existed from an earlier forgotten age, the practical approach would be to appropriate it, modify it to fit current religious and political needs, and integrate it into the contemporary ceremonial complex, without necessarily understanding or recording its true origins. The absence of any hieroglyphic inscription claiming credit for carving the Sphinx, so anomalous for a culture that documented everything and whose pharaohs competed to associate themselves with the greatest monuments, begins to make sense if the Sphinx was already ancient when dynastic Egypt began, already mysterious in its origins, already attributed to the gods or to mythical antediluvian kings, and thus not something that any mortal pharaoh could plausibly claim to have created, even in an age when claiming credit for predecessors' work was standard practice. The challenge of understanding what might have existed before the archaeological record becomes even more acute when we consider the catastrophic impact of sea level rise at the end of the last ice age. Because during the glacial maximum, approximately 20,000 years ago, when vast quantities of water were locked up in continental ice sheets, sea levels were roughly 120 meters lower than they are today, exposing enormous areas of continental shelf that are now submerged beneath the oceans. And human populations then, as now, concentrated along coastlines and river valleys, where resources were abundant and transportation was easy. Which means that if sophisticated cultures existed during the late Paleolithic or early Holocene periods, their cities and settlements would have been located precisely in the zones that are now underwater, drowned beneath hundreds of feet of ocean when the ice sheets melted and the seas rose over the course of several thousand years. The implications of this are staggering, because it means that the accessible archaeological record of human prehistory is fundamentally incomplete, biased toward inland sites that happened to survive the inundation, while the potentially richest evidence of early civilization lies on submerged continental shelves that have only recently begun to be explored through marine archaeology. And indeed, underwater archaeological surveys in the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, the Caribbean, and off the coasts of Japan and India have discovered enigmatic structures that resist easy classification. Massive stone formations that appear too regular to be natural, but too ancient to fit conventional chronologies. Submerged settlements and harbours from periods when those locations were above water. And, most tantalizingly, hints of sophisticated construction techniques being employed in contexts that predate the supposed invention of those techniques. The Yonaguni Monument off Japan's coast remains controversial, with some researchers interpreting it as a natural formation, selectively modified by humans, while others see evidence of deliberately carved terraces and right angles and what appear to be tool marks. And regardless of which interpretation proves correct, the structure's existence underwater in a location that was last above sea level approximately 10,000 years ago demonstrates that humans were active in coastal areas during precisely the period when the Sphinx's erosion suggests it was carved, raising the possibility that what we think of as the beginning of civilization was actually a renaissance following a catastrophic interruption. Survivors rebuilding from fragments of knowledge preserved through oral tradition, or in monuments like the Sphinx that were too massive to destroy and too impressive to ignore. The selective survival of megalithic monuments, while everything else from ancient cultures disappears, creates a profound sampling bias in archaeology, because we are necessarily looking only at what remains rather than at what existed. And this is similar to the famous problem of survivorship bias, illustrated by the story of Abraham Wald during World War II, when the military wanted to add armour to aircraft and studied the bullet holes in returning planes to determine where armour was most needed. And while the obvious approach was to armour the areas with the most bullet holes, Wald realised that the planes they were examining had survived despite being hit in those locations, which meant the truly critical areas were those where the returning planes had not been hit, because planes hit in those areas did not return at all, were shot down and lost, creating a pattern in the available data that pointed exactly away from the truth. In the same way, the archaeological sites we excavate and the monuments we study represent only the survivors, the locations that happened to be preserved, the materials that happened to endure, while vast categories of evidence have been lost to decomposition, looting, recycling, submersion, or simply passage of time. And from this survivor's sample, we must extrapolate backward to reconstruct entire civilizations, always aware that what we cannot see might be more significant than what we can, that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and that the limits of archaeology are not the limits of what occurred in the past, but merely the limits of what has survived to the present. The Georgia Guidestones, before their demolition in 2022, stood as a modern example of how megalithic construction serves as communication across time, because these massive granite slabs, inscribed with principles for rebuilding civilization after some imagined catastrophe, were explicitly designed to endure for ages, to remain standing and readable when everything else about our current civilization has crumbled and been forgotten. And they demonstrate that the impulse toward permanent stone monuments is not an artifact of primitive thinking, but rather a rational response to the problem of deep time communication. A recognition that if you want to speak to the far future, you cannot rely on books or computers or any technology that requires maintenance and interpretation, but must instead carve your message into stone and trust that the sheer mass and durability of the medium will carry meaning forward, even if the specific language becomes incomprehensible. The irony is that the guide stones lasted barely 4 decades before being destroyed by human violence, while the Sphinx has endured for at least 45 centuries, according to conventional dating, or possibly 120 centuries, according to geological evidence, demonstrating that even our most durable modern constructions are fragile compared to the megalithic monuments of antiquity. This perspective transforms how we should think about monuments like the Sphinx, because if we accept that most evidence of ancient cultures inevitably disappears, that what survives is only the most durable fraction of what existed, and that human populations concentrated in coastal areas, now submerged by post-glacial sea level rise, then the Sphinx might represent not an anomaly requiring special explanation, but rather exactly what we should expect to find. A stone monument massive enough to survive 10,000 years of weathering, impressive enough that subsequent cultures preserved and incorporated it rather than destroying it, and isolated enough from its original context that its true age and purpose have become mysterious. Because everything else about the civilization that created it, all the perishable buildings and organic artifacts and written records on biodegradable materials, has long since vanished into the earth. The question then becomes not whether a pre-Egyptian civilization could have created the Sphinx without leaving the usual archaeological traces, but rather why we would expect such traces to survive in recognizable form after so many millennia, and whether our methodologies for understanding the deep past are adequate to detect civilizations that rose and fell before the invention of pottery, before the development of agriculture, before any of the material culture markers that archaeologists rely on to distinguish one period from another, existed in forms that could endure the ages. The question of whether the Great Sphinx predates dynastic Egypt by thousands of years is not merely an academic dispute over the dating of a single monument, nor is it simply a controversy confined to the specialized journals of geology and Egyptology, but rather it represents something far more profound and unsettling, a challenge to our fundamental understanding of who we are as a species, when and how we developed the capacity for complex civilization, and whether the story we tell ourselves about humanity's linear progression from primitive origins to technological sophistication is an accurate representation of our past, or merely a comforting fiction that helps us make sense of fragmentary evidence while ignoring the uncomfortable implications of what the stones themselves might be telling us. If the Sphinx truly was carved during the African humid period, between 10 and 12,000 years ago, then we must confront the possibility that everything we think we know about the timeline of human achievement is wrong by several millennia. That sophisticated civilizations rose and fell before the beginning of recorded history. That knowledge and capabilities were lost in catastrophic collapses and had to be painstakingly rediscovered by survivors. and that our species' relationship with complexity and culture is characterized not by steady, upward progress, but by cycles of achievement and disaster, Renaissance and Dark Age, enlightenment and forgetting, that stretch back far deeper into prehistory than our current models acknowledge. The evidence, such as it is, remains frustratingly ambiguous and maddeningly incomplete, with geological observations pointing in one direction while archaeological context points in another, creating a situation where certainty is impossible, and where honest scholars can examine the same monument and reach radically different conclusions depending on which type of evidence they privilege and which methodological assumptions they bring to the investigation. On one side stand the geological arguments that seem nearly irrefutable. The deep, vertical weathering patterns carved into the Sphinx and its enclosure that are characteristic of sustained rainfall erosion. The contrast between these patterns and the horizontal, wind-driven erosion, visible on monuments that unquestionably date to the dry period of dynastic Egypt. The fact that the Sahara has not experienced the kind of prolonged heavy rainfall necessary to create such erosion for at least 7,000 years, and possibly not since the end of the African humid period, around 10,000 BCE. And the testimony of geologists who have examined the site and concluded that the weathering patterns are inconsistent with the monument having been carved during the 4th dynasty, around 2500 BCE, as conventional Egyptology maintains. On the other side stand equally compelling archaeological arguments that cannot be dismissed without abandoning the entire methodology that has successfully reconstructed ancient civilizations across the globe. The temples and causeways surrounding the Sphinx that clearly date to Khafre's reign, and that seem to have been designed as an integrated complex with the monument itself. The complete absence of any settlement remains or material culture from the supposed earlier period that would indicate a civilization capable of undertaking such ambitious construction. The lack of comparable monuments from the same period that might corroborate the existence of a pre-Egyptian culture with megalithic building traditions. And the general principle that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, which in this case would mean not just weathering patterns that might be explained by alternative mechanisms like groundwater seepage or chemical weathering, but rather a comprehensive body of evidence including tools, habitation sites, artistic traditions, and other monuments that would demonstrate, beyond reasonable doubt, that a sophisticated civilization existed in North Africa thousands of years before the emergence of dynastic Egypt. The impasse between these two types of evidence reflects a deeper tension in how we approach the study of the past. Because geology operates according to physical laws that are consistent across time and space, where weathering patterns are determined by the interaction of water and stone through processes that can be observed and measured and replicated, while archaeology must contend with the vagaries of preservation and discovery, with the fact that absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence, and with the reality that most material culture does not survive millennia of exposure to decay and disturbance, creating a situation where each discipline is working from different datasets and applying different standards of proof to questions that ultimately require integrating multiple lines of evidence into a coherent narrative. Perhaps what the Sphinx controversy reveals most clearly is not that one discipline is right and the other wrong, but rather that our current understanding of human prehistory is based on incomplete information and provisional conclusions that must remain open to revision as new evidence emerges and new analytical methods become available, and that the boundary between what we know and what we assume is far more permeable and uncertain than the confident pronouncements in textbooks and museum labels would suggest. The broader implications of potentially rewriting the timeline of civilization extend far beyond Egypt and touch upon questions of cultural identity, national pride, and the narratives that modern nations construct about their ancient heritage. Because Egypt's entire tourism economy and much of its national identity rest upon the claim to possess the world's oldest continuous civilization, the original source from which later cultures borrowed and learned, and to suggest that the most iconic monument in Egypt might predate Egyptian civilization itself, threatens not just academic theories, but economic interests and deeply held beliefs about cultural supremacy and historical priority. This explains, at least in part, why Egyptian authorities have been consistently hostile to geological dating of the Sphinx, why permits for certain types of research have been denied, and why the controversy has sometimes taken on nationalist overtones, with accusations that Western scientists are attempting to rob Egypt of its rightful heritage, when in fact, the scientific question of when the Sphinx was carved should be entirely separate from questions of cultural ownership and contemporary national identity, though in practice, these issues become hopelessly entangled in ways that complicate the pursuit of objective truth. If we allow ourselves to imagine, purely as a thought experiment, what a revised timeline of human civilization might look like, if the geological evidence for the Sphinx's greater antiquity proves correct, we would need to envision waves of cultural development, rather than a single linear progression, with sophisticated societies emerging during favorable climatic periods, flourishing for centuries or millennia, and then collapsing or fragmenting when environmental conditions changed, leaving behind only their most durable monuments, while everything else about their culture, their languages and literature, their daily tools and technologies, their social structures and belief systems, vanished with them, or survived only in distorted form through oral traditions that later peoples would remember as myths about golden ages and antediluvian wisdom. The African humid period, when the Sahara was a verdant landscape of rivers and lakes, rather than the hostile desert it has been for the past 7,000 years, would have provided ideal conditions for human populations to concentrate, develop surplus food production, create specialized crafts and technologies, and invest resources in monumental architecture. And then, as the climate shifted and the rains failed and the desert encroached, these populations would have been forced to migrate to the few remaining water sources, like the Nile Valley, becoming the ancestors of the dynastic Egyptians who found weathered stone monuments already present in the landscape and incorporated them into their own religious and political systems without necessarily understanding or recording their true origins. This cyclical model of civilization rising and falling in response to climate change and other catastrophic pressures finds support not only in the geological record of dramatic environmental shifts during the Holocene period, but also in the historical pattern of cultural collapse and knowledge loss that appears repeatedly even in well-documented eras. Because the fragility of human achievement becomes evident when we consider how the Bronze Age civilizations of the eastern Mediterranean, were nearly all destroyed within a span of decades around 1200 BCE, plunging the region into centuries of reduced literacy and technological capacity. Or how the Library of Alexandria's destruction represented an incalculable loss of ancient knowledge that has never been fully recovered. Or how the fall of the Western Roman Empire resulted in the loss of engineering techniques that would not be rediscovered for over 1,000 years. Or how countless indigenous cultures around the world possessed sophisticated astronomical observations, medicinal knowledge, and sustainable environmental practices that were lost to colonization and cultural genocide, demonstrating that progress is never guaranteed, that knowledge accumulated over generations can disappear in a single catastrophe, and that civilizations which seem permanent and invulnerable can collapse with stunning rapidity when subjected to sufficient stress. The pattern repeats across different continents and different eras with such consistency that it should force us to reconsider our assumption that civilization is a one-way journey toward increasing complexity. Because the Maya civilization of Central America achieved remarkable sophistication in mathematics, astronomy, and architecture, before experiencing a mysterious collapse that saw their great cities abandoned and reclaimed by jungle. While the Khmer Empire built the massive temple complex of Angkor Wat and sustained a population of nearly 1 million people, before environmental degradation and political instability led to decline and abandonment. And even in our own era, we have witnessed how quickly technological societies can fragment, how rapidly infrastructure can decay when maintenance ceases, and how vulnerable our accumulated knowledge has become now that so much of it exists only in digital formats that require continuous technological support to remain accessible. The hubris of believing that our current civilization is somehow immune to the forces that destroyed previous societies, that we have finally escaped the cycle of rise and fall that characterized all earlier human cultures, begins to seem not like rational confidence based on our technological capabilities, but rather like a failure of historical imagination, an inability to recognize that the same vulnerabilities that brought down Rome and the Maya and countless other civilizations, resource depletion, environmental change, social complexity exceeding our ability to manage it, the fragility of supply chains and specialized knowledge, remain present in our world, and perhaps even magnified by the global scale and interconnected nature of modern civilization. One of the most persistent assumptions that the Sphinx controversy challenges is the idea that sophisticated civilization necessarily requires writing, that we can only recognize a culture as truly complex if they left behind written records that we can decipher and interpret. But this assumption reveals more about our own cultural biases than about the actual requirements for social complexity. Because numerous cultures throughout history have achieved remarkable levels of organization, technological sophistication, and cultural achievement without developing writing systems. The Inca Empire, at its height, controlled a territory stretching thousands of miles along the Andes, built extensive road networks and sophisticated agricultural terraces, developed advanced metallurgy and textile production, and created an elaborate bureaucratic system for managing resources and labor, all without a writing system as we conventionally understand it. Instead, using quipus, knotted strings that encoded numerical and possibly narrative information through a system so complex that we still cannot fully decipher it. Despite knowing that the Inca themselves used these devices to maintain detailed records of everything from tax obligations to historical events. Similarly, countless cultures have preserved vast bodies of knowledge through oral traditions that were passed down through generations with remarkable fidelity, encoding astronomical observations, genealogical information, historical events, and technical knowledge in songs and stories and ritual performances that served as living libraries, maintained not in written form, but in human memory and practice. Australian Aboriginal cultures maintained oral histories that accurately described coastal geography and sea levels from over 7,000 years ago, before the flooding of what is now the Torres Strait, preserving in their Dreamtime stories geological events that occurred when their ancestors actually witnessed the landscape transformation, while Polynesian navigators memorized vast bodies of information about star positions, ocean currents, bird behavior, and wave patterns that allowed them to traverse thousands of miles of open ocean and discover virtually every habitable island in the Pacific, using techniques that European sailors, with their written charts and instruments, could barely comprehend. If a sophisticated culture existed during the African humid period and carved the Sphinx as one of their monumental achievements, we should not necessarily expect them to have possessed writing, especially not writing on materials that could survive 10,000 years of subsequent history. And their absence of written records should not be taken as evidence of their non-existence, any more than the Incas' lack of alphabetic writing should be taken as evidence that they were not a complex civilization. Because the capabilities required to organize the labor for megalithic construction, to develop technical knowledge for stone carving, to maintain the social cohesion necessary for multi-generational projects, and to conceive of monuments with symbolic or astronomical significance, do not inherently depend on literacy, but rather on the kinds of practical knowledge, observational skills, and cultural transmission mechanisms that humans have possessed for tens of thousands of years, and that can exist and flourish in societies that preserve their knowledge through means other than writing. The resistance to revising the chronology of the Sphinx and potentially rewriting significant portions of our understanding of early civilization comes not from willful blindness or academic conspiracy, but from the legitimate methodological conservatism that prevents scientific fields from constantly churning through revolutionary new paradigms every time anomalous evidence appears. Because if we were to abandon established timelines every time a single piece of evidence seemed to contradict them, we would have no stable framework for understanding anything about the past, no ability to build cumulative knowledge, and no defense against pseudo-archaeological fantasies that exploit gaps in our understanding to promote unfounded speculations about ancient aliens or Atlantean supercivilizations. The proper scientific approach requires maintaining existing models until sufficient evidence accumulates to make a new paradigm not merely possible, but necessary, until the anomalies become so numerous and so well documented that the old framework can no longer accommodate them without increasingly convoluted, ad hoc explanations, and until alternative models emerge that can account for all the evidence that supported the previous paradigm, while also explaining the anomalies that the old paradigm could not handle. For the Sphinx specifically, definitive resolution of the dating controversy would require evidence that currently does not exist, but that could potentially be discovered through continued research, perhaps the excavation of sites in the Sahara or on now submerged portions of the North African coast, that would reveal material culture contemporary with the proposed earlier carving of the Sphinx, or the development of new techniques for directly dating the stone itself, rather than relying on indirect dating of surrounding artifacts, or the discovery of organic material in sealed contexts within or beneath the monument that could provide radiocarbon dates inconsistent with the conventional timeline, or, conversely, the discovery of quarry sites and tool marks and construction debris that would conclusively demonstrate that the Sphinx was carved during the Old Kingdom, using techniques consistent with other monuments from that period. The absence of such definitive evidence means that the controversy will likely continue, with geologists and archaeologists talking past each other, because they are fundamentally evaluating different types of data according to different disciplinary standards. And while this uncertainty may be frustrating for those who want clear answers and settled questions, it represents exactly how science should function, maintaining provisional conclusions based on available evidence, while remaining open to revision if new evidence emerges. Recent technological developments offer tantalizing possibilities for resolving some of these questions, because advances in ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery analysis, underwater archaeology, and various dating techniques are continually expanding what we can discover about the past and pushing back the boundaries of the knowable, allowing us to detect buried structures without excavation, to map submerged coastlines and identify promising archaeological sites on continental shelves, to extract and analyze ancient DNA from contexts that would have been impossible to study a generation ago, and to date materials with increasing precision using methods that combine multiple independent lines of evidence. The Sphinx itself has been the subject of various scanning and imaging studies that have revealed previously unknown chambers and passages beneath and around it, though Egyptian authorities have been reluctant to authorize invasive investigations that might damage the monument or challenge established narratives, creating a situation where technology has outpaced our willingness to apply it to controversial questions, and where political and cultural considerations constrain what scientific research is permitted, even when that research might definitively resolve long-standing mysteries. What makes the Sphinx controversy ultimately valuable, regardless of how the dating question is eventually resolved, is the way it forces us to confront our assumptions about the past, and to recognize the profound limitations of what we can know with certainty about events that occurred before the invention of writing, before the development of the material. Culture markers that archaeologists use to distinguish one period from another, and in many cases, before the climatic and geological conditions that exist today were established. The hubris of thinking that we have definitively mapped out the entire trajectory of human civilization, that we understand with confidence when and how our ancestors made the transition from nomadic hunter-gatherers to settled agriculturalists to urban civilizations, begins to dissolve when we consider how much of the archaeological record has been lost to decomposition and erosion and sea level rise. How many potential sites remain unexplored beneath the oceans or buried under meters of sediment, and how frequently new discoveries force us to revise supposedly settled questions about human capabilities and chronologies. Every few years brings some new archaeological discovery that pushes back the dates for supposedly recent innovations. Stone tools, thought to be 2 million years old, turn out to be 3 million years old. Sophisticated cave paintings in Indonesia prove to be as ancient as the famous examples in France and Spain. Evidence of long-distance trade networks and symbolic behavior appears in contexts far earlier than previously believed. And each of these discoveries should humble us about the confidence with which we make pronouncements about what ancient peoples could or could not have accomplished, about when various capabilities first emerged, and about the neat, linear progression from simple to complex that our textbooks present as established fact rather than as provisional hypothesis subject to continual revision. The Sphinx stands as it has stood for millennia, weathered and enigmatic, gazing eastward toward the rising sun with the same inscrutable expression, whether it was carved 45 centuries ago or 120 centuries ago. And perhaps that very inscrutability, that resistance to our attempts to definitively categorize and explain it, serves as a kind of answer to the questions we bring to it. Because what the Sphinx ultimately teaches us is not any specific fact about ancient Egypt or pre-Egyptian civilizations, but rather a lesson in intellectual humility about the limits of human knowledge and the necessity of maintaining what Keats called negative capability, the ability to remain in uncertainties and mysteries and doubts without irritably reaching after fact and reason. We may never know with absolute certainty who carved the Sphinx, or when, or why. Just as future archaeologists, excavating our ruins thousands of years hence, may never fully understand the significance of Mount Rushmore, or the purpose of Stonehenge, or the meaning of the countless enigmatic artifacts that every civilization leaves scattered in its wake. And this limitation is not a failure of methodology or a gap that more research will inevitably fill, but rather a fundamental feature of the human condition. The reality that we are creatures of time, looking backward into depths that grow increasingly murky and ambiguous the further we peer, trying to reconstruct worlds from fragments, to hear voices across millennia of silence, to understand minds fundamentally different from our own, operating in contexts we can only dimly imagine. The controversy surrounding the Sphinx's age also raises profound questions about the nature of historical truth and the ways in which evidence, interpretation, and cultural narrative interact to create the stories we tell about the past. Because history is never simply a matter of objective facts waiting to be discovered, but is always a construction, shaped by the questions we ask, the methodologies we employ, the assumptions we bring to the evidence, and the cultural contexts within which we work. Meaning that different observers can look at the same monument and see radically different things depending on their disciplinary training, their theoretical commitments, and their willingness to challenge established narratives. The geologist sees weathering patterns that speak of ancient rainfall. The Egyptologist sees architectural context that speaks of Fourth Dynasty construction. The independent researcher sees evidence of lost civilizations. And the skeptic sees the all-too-human tendency to find mystery and conspiracy where mundane explanations suffice. And sorting out which of these perspectives has the strongest claim to truth requires not just examining the physical evidence, but also interrogating our own biases, acknowledging the limits of our methodologies, and remaining humble about the provisional nature of all historical knowledge. Whether the Sphinx was carved 4,500 years ago by the workers of Pharaoh Khafra during the 4th dynasty of Egypt's Old Kingdom, or whether it was carved 12,000 years ago by a forgotten people during the African Humid period, and later appropriated by the dynastic Egyptians, who found it already ancient and mysterious in their landscape, it continues to pose the same fundamental question to every generation that stands before it. What do you really know about where you came from? About the capabilities of your ancestors? About the deep history that made you possible? And are you humble enough to admit that the answer might be less than you think, and perhaps less than you can ever know with certainty? The value of that question, and the discomfort it produces, and the intellectual humility it demands, may ultimately be more important than any definitive answer we might someday reach, because it keeps us searching, keeps us questioning our assumptions, keeps us open to the possibility that human history is stranger and more complex and more magnificent than our current models can capture, and reminds us that the greatest mysteries are not always the ones we solve, but the ones that continue to challenge us, generation after generation, to look deeper, think harder, and remain forever curious about the inexhaustible strangeness of our own past. In the end, the Sphinx offers us not closure, but continuation, not answers, but better questions, not certainty, but the invitation to stand in wonder before the achievements of those who came before us, whoever they were, and whenever they lived. And to recognize that in our relationship with the past, we are always standing on the threshold between knowing and unknowing, between the comforting narratives that help us make sense of fragmentary evidence and the unsettling possibility that those narratives are incomplete or incorrect, between the human need for certainty and the intellectual honesty that requires us to acknowledge how much remains uncertain, how much has been lost, and how much we may never recover. No matter how sophisticated our technologies become, or how diligently we search for truth among the ruins and monuments that survived when everything else turned to dust.